In 1902, in a stand of redwood on the Northern California coast, a crew of 14 men spent 3 days felling a single tree. When it finally hit the ground, the impact registered on a seismograph 50 miles away. The trunk measured 17 feet across. It weighed an estimated 400 tons. And here is the question nobody asks. How did they move it? There were no trucks, no bulldozers, no paved roads anywhere near that forest. The nearest sawmill was 8 miles through dense timber and broken mountain terrain. And yet, somehow, that tree got out. Not just that one, millions of them. The biggest trees that have ever stood on the North American continent were hauled out of the deepest forests by men using horses, water, steam, and ideas so wild that most of them have been completely forgotten today. This is the story of how America moved giant logs before trucks existed. The forgotten machines, the dangerous men, and the insane engineering that built a country out of timber. To understand any of this, you have to first understand the trees, because the forests that covered America before 1900 were not the forests we have today, not even close. When the first commercial logging crews pushed into the Great Lakes region in the 1840s, they walked into a world of white pines that had been growing for 400 years, trees over 6 feet thick, trees so tall that 19th century photographs of them look fake. Trees with trunks so straight and clear that a single one could be cut into more than 10,000 board feet of lumber. And then came the Pacific Northwest, Douglas fir, western red cedar, Sitka spruce, trees that made the Great Lakes pines look small. The largest specimens topped out at over 300 feet tall, with trunks 12 to 15 feet thick at the base. A single old-growth Douglas fir could weigh more than 200 tons. That is heavier than a fully loaded 18-wheeler. It is the weight of a small commercial airliner, and every single one of these trees, once it was on the ground, had to be moved. In the early days, the only answer was animals, specifically oxen and draft horses. A single team of oxen, 6 or 8 pairs harnessed together, could drag logs that weighed 20,000 pounds or more. But the ground in a working forest is brutal. Stumps, mud, fallen branches, slopes, swamps. You cannot just drag a giant log through that and expect to get anywhere. So loggers invented the skid road. They felled smaller trees, stripped them, and laid them across the ground like railroad ties. Then they greased these skids with bear fat, fish oil, or whatever else they had on hand. The big logs slid across the surface with shocking efficiency. A skilled bullwhacker, the man who drove the ox team, could pull 30,000 pounds of timber over greased skids that would have stopped any wagon dead in its tracks. Those rough timber roads ran straight through company towns. The neighborhoods that grew up alongside them were full of cheap saloons, brothels, and flop houses for the men who worked the timber. That is where we got the phrase Skid Row. It started in Seattle, on a real skid road that ran down toward the harbor. A century later, the term means something else entirely. But it started here, in the mud and grease of a logging operation. But oxen had a problem. They were slow, they tired. They could only work in cool weather, on solid ground. And in a country racing to clear forests faster than anyone in human history had ever cleared forests, slow was not going to cut it. Enter Silas Overpack, a wagon maker in Manistee, Michigan, who, in 1875, looked at the problem of summer logging and came up with one of the most distinctive machines in American history. The big wheels. Imagine 2 wooden wagon wheels, each one nearly 10 feet tall, joined by a single axle. A log was chained underneath the axle, so its front end was lifted off the ground, the back end dragged. Now, suddenly, an ox team could pull logs across summer terrain that had been completely impassable before. No more waiting for winter snow to make the ground slick. No more being stuck for months out of the year. Overpack sold thousands of pairs of big wheels. They became so iconic that for a generation, you could not look at a Michigan logging operation without seeing them rolling through the woods. There are still a few preserved at museums in the Upper Peninsula. They look like something out of a steampunk fever dream. They were the family sedan of the timber industry for almost 40 years. But the real highway of the old logging world was not on land at all. It was the river. This was the genius of 19th century logging operations. You did not need to build roads. You did not need to lay rails. You just needed to get the log to a creek, and gravity and snowmelt would do the rest. Every spring, when the rivers swelled with melting mountain snow, loggers would push millions of logs into the water and drive them downstream like cattle. The Penobscot in Maine, the Clearwater in Idaho, the St. Croix in Minnesota. Every major timber-producing river in America became a flowing conveyor belt during drive season. But this was not like floating a stick in a stream. We are talking about logs the size of telephone poles, weighing tens of thousands of pounds each, all moving together in a churning mass. When they jammed catastrophically. A single log catching sideways could pile up 30 feet high and stretch for half a mile up the river. These jams were so dangerous they had to be broken apart by hand, by men called river pigs. The river pig was the cowboy of the eastern logging world. He wore corked boots, which were leatherwork boots with steel spikes driven through the soles. He carried a long pike pole, and his job was to run, jump, and dance across moving logs in freezing white water, prying jams loose, keeping the drive moving downstream. When a log jam was found, a key log had to be identified, the one log holding the whole pile in place. A river pig would climb onto the jam, find that log, and chop it free. Then he would run for his life. Because once that key log went, the entire jam came apart in seconds, and a wall of timber and water would sweep down the river. If you were still on it when it broke, you were dead. There was no swimming through a log drive. The water was full of grinding, rolling timber moving at speeds nobody could outrun. River pigs had a saying, "Bury the dead and feed the living," because every spring, several of them did not make it home. But the river drives had a limit. They needed water. And in the dry summer creeks of the Pacific Northwest and the Sierra Nevada, the water just was not there. So loggers invented the splash dam. A splash dam was a temporary timber dam built across a small creek. Crews would pile up logs behind it for weeks or months, letting a small stream slowly fill the reservoir. Then, on the day of the drive, they would knock out the supports. The dam blew. A wall of water exploded down the creek, carrying the entire stockpile of logs miles downstream in minutes. It was effective. It was also an environmental catastrophe nobody fully understood at the time. Splash dams scoured creek beds down to bedrock. They wiped out salmon runs that had supported indigenous communities for thousands of years. Some Pacific Northwest watersheds have never recovered, even 100 years later. The Coquille River in Oregon, the Skagit in Washington, dozens of others. Their salmon populations crashed during the splash dam era and never came back to the numbers they had before. It was a machine made out of wood and gravity, and it reshaped entire ecosystems. By the 1880s, though, a new force was about to change: logging forever. Steam. In 1881, a man named John Dolbear was running a logging operation in Humboldt County, California. He was tired of losing oxen to exhaustion and accidents. So he sat down and designed something new: a small portable steam engine bolted to a wooden sled with a vertical winch drum. He called it the steam donkey. The way it worked was simple. You set the donkey down at the landing. You ran a long steel cable out into the woods, attached it to a log, and then you fired up the boiler. The cable would wind up onto the drum, and that log, no matter how big, came rolling and crashing through the underbrush at speeds no animal team could match. A single steam donkey, operated by 4 or 5 men, could do the work of 50 oxen. Suddenly, crews shrank. Animal teams disappeared. The output of an operation tripled, then quadrupled. Within 20 years, every major logging operation in America had a steam donkey or a dozen. They had names painted on their boilers: the Black Maria, the Iron Mike, the Widowmaker. They sat in the forest, hissing and pumping and yarding logs out of places no horse or ox could ever go. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the forgotten machines of American industry, take a second to hit that subscribe button. It is the only way to make sure stories like this keep showing up in your feed. But getting logs to the landing was only half the problem. You still had to move them out of the mountains. And for that, the answer was steel. Logging railroads were unlike anything else on rails. Standard locomotives could not handle the grades or the tight curves of mountain logging operations, so engineers built specialty machines. The Shea locomotive, designed in 1877 by a Michigan logger named Ephraim Shea, used vertical cylinders and a flexible drive shaft to power every wheel on every truck. It could climb grades twice as steep as a regular train and grind around curves so tight a normal locomotive would derail. The Climax and the Heisler followed similar designs. These machines were ugly, they were slow, they sounded like the end of the world, and they could pull a chained string of loaded log cars up a 1,000-foot mountain on track that had been laid the week before. Logging companies built tens of thousands of miles of temporary railroad in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The track moved as the cutting moved. When a section of forest was logged out, crews would pull up the rails, load them onto flat cars, and lay them somewhere new. Some of these rail beds are still visible today, deep in the second growth forests of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Hiking trails that follow oddly straight, level cuts through the woods. That is what they are. Old logging grades, abandoned a century ago, but even the Shea locomotive had limits. You could not lay track up a vertical cliff. You could not run rails across a swamp. And so, for the truly impossible terrain, loggers turned to the sky. The high lead system was one of the most dangerous and ingenious machines ever invented. The idea was simple. Pick a tree at your landing site, the tallest one you can find, climb it, cut off the top, rig it with steel cables and pulleys. Now run a main cable all the way out to the cutting site, anchor it to a smaller tree there, and you have a skyline. Logs could be hooked to that cable, lifted entirely off the ground, and flown back to the landing through the air. It was incredible to watch. A 200-foot Douglas fir, a single log weighing 50 tons, sailing through the air over swamps and ravines like it was nothing. But somebody had to climb that spar tree and rig it. And that somebody was the high climber. The high climber was a specialist. He was paid more than anyone else in the camp because his job was straight up suicidal. He would strap a pair of climbing spurs to his boots, loop a flexible steel rope around the tree trunk, and walk himself up 200 feet of swaying timber, cutting off branches as he went. At the top, he would chop the entire crown off the tree, a piece of wood that might weigh several tons, while standing on the trunk it had just been attached to. When that crown fell, the whole tree would whip back and forth violently. The high climber had to ride that whip 200 feet in the air, with no safety equipment beyond his rope. They were the rock stars of the logging camps. They were also dying constantly. Falls, snapped cables, the whip itself ripping a man loose. The phrase "widowmaker" was originally about logging branches that fell from above without warning, killing the man underneath. But it could just as easily have meant the spar tree job. In the dry mountain country of California and Nevada, crews tried something different. The flume. A logging flume was a long, V-shaped wooden trough, sometimes 50 miles long or more, that ran from a high mountain mill all the way down to a railhead in the valley. Water was diverted from a creek into the top of the flume, and logs and finished lumber would float down at 30 or 40 miles an hour. Some men actually rode the flumes. There are old photographs from Tahoe and the Sierras showing flume riders sitting on planks, hurtling down miles of wooden trough through the mountains. It was technically against company rules. It was also one of the most thrilling rides in 19th century America. The flumes were marvels. The Pacific Lumber Company in California operated one that ran for over 50 miles. The Sanger lumber flume in the Sierras dropped 4,000 vertical feet from start to finish. They were wooden water slides for industrial timber, and they worked beautifully until the trees ran out. Through all of this, the logging industry had a quiet, ugly secret. The men were dying. Constantly. Modern OSHA statistics did not exist. Most companies did not even keep injury records. But what we can piece together from old hospital logs and county death records is brutal. In the Pacific Northwest, around the turn of the century, somewhere around 1 in every 200 working loggers died on the job each year. That is not lifetime risk. That is annual, crushed by falling logs, drowned in river drives, decapitated by snapped steel cables that whipped through the air faster than a bullet, killed by widowmaker branches falling from the canopy. There are old cemeteries in towns like Aberdeen, Washington, and Eureka, California, where you can still walk among the headstones of young men, 20, 25 years old, who never came home from a single shift in the woods. The work paid well by the standards of the day. It also killed at rates that would shut down any modern industry overnight. By the 1910s, change was finally coming. Two California companies, Holt and Best, had been experimenting with tracked tractors. Steam-powered at first, then gasoline. These machines could crawl across mud, swamp, and soft ground that no horse or ox could handle. Loggers were among the first customers. The Holt crawler became so iconic that the British military bought thousands of them during the First World War, used them as the basis for the first tanks, and helped change warfare forever. After the war, Holt and Best merged to form a new company. They called it Caterpillar. Yes, that Caterpillar. The yellow construction equipment company that dominates the world today started by hauling logs out of Pacific Northwest mud. And right alongside the crawlers, the first practical logging trucks were starting to appear. Solid rubber tires, chain drives, engines just barely strong enough to pull a single log down a rough dirt road. By 1925, internal combustion was replacing steam in the woods. By 1940, the river drives were almost completely gone, replaced by trucks running on dirt and gravel logging roads. The world that had moved logs with oxen, water, steam, and steel cable had ended. And it had ended fast. Less than 20 years from the first crawler to the near total dominance of the truck. But here is the part that does not get talked about. The thing that all of this was actually doing. Those forests, the ones with trees so big they would not fit in a modern logging truck, those forests were over 1,000 years old. The oldest trees in the Pacific Northwest had been alive when the Vikings reached Greenland. Some had been alive longer than that. In a span of about 70 years, between roughly 1870 and 1940, the American logging industry took down over 90% of those forests. Today, less than 5% of original American old growth remains. The biggest trees, the ones that astounded the early loggers and inspired all of those wild machines, they are almost entirely gone. The salmon runs that fed indigenous nations for 10,000 years collapsed during the splash dam era and never fully recovered. Whole ecosystems that took thousands of years to build were turned into railroad ties, mine timbers, and house frames in less than a single human lifetime. The cities of America were quite literally built out of those forests. The houses on every block of older neighborhoods in San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, are framed in old-growth Douglas fir and white pine. You are still living inside those trees. You just do not know it. The men who moved them, the bullwhackers and river pigs and high climbers and donkey punchers, they have mostly faded into folklore. Paul Bunyan was based on real men, working in real woods, doing things that would terrify any modern industrial worker. The machines they used, the big wheels and steam donkeys, and shay locomotives and high lead systems, sit rusting in forest preserves and small-town museums across the country. Most people walk past them and have no idea what they are looking at. But for almost a century, they were the entire backbone of how America got built. Before the truck, before the bulldozer, before the chainsaw, there was an army of men, animals, water, and steam, hauling out the biggest trees the continent ever grew. And every house, every railroad tie, every piece of timber in this country traces back to them. Next time you walk through a second growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, look around. The straight, level cuts running through the trees, those are old logging grades. The rusty cables you sometimes find tangled in the underbrush, those are the remains of high lead operations. The strange level shelves cut into hillsides, splash dam sites, where a creek used to be a reservoir for a few weeks every spring. The forest is still full of ghosts. Ghosts of an industry, ghosts of the men who worked it, and ghosts of trees that will not grow back in our lifetime, or our children's lifetime, or possibly ever again. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person who keeps stories like this alive. So, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, because there are dozens more forgotten machines, forgotten trades, and forgotten corners of American industrial history coming to this channel. Smash the like button if you learned something new today, even one thing, because that tells the algorithm to show this video to other people who care about this kind of history. And drop a comment down below. Tell me which part of the old logging world surprised you the most. The river pigs running across moving timber, the high climbers 200 feet in the air, the flume riders hurtling down a wooden water slide through the Sierra Mountains. I read every comment, and the best ones often turn into the next video on this channel. Because the men who hauled those giants out of the woods deserve to be remembered, every single one of them.